Ladies and gentlemen, dear members and colleagues, on behalf of the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition, I wish you a good morning. My name is Sven Rösner and I will present today's webinar. I hope that you and your families are well. Thank you very much for having registered and tuned in today for this session during which we shall take a look at the European climate targets for 2030. Some of you might have followed the presentations and discussions of the Franco-German Energy Forum on November 3rd. I found it very striking how anonymously the speakers insisted on the necessity of ambitious targets despite their different backgrounds. However, it was also obvious that approaches on how these are to be achieved varied significantly in terms of their order of priorities and scope. It is likely that mankind never had to fulfill a challenge of a magnitude comparable to those of the Paris climate targets. And while much has been done in this context over the past years, also in France and in Germany, there can be little doubt about the fact that the major part of the work lies ahead of us. Today, we would like to take a closer look at the current situation and at how things will evolve. And it is a great privilege for me to welcome today's speakers, Graham Beale from the Ruhr University in Bochum and Andreas Graf from Agora Energiewende. Good morning to you. We are very much looking forward to hear what you have to say in a minute. Before I pass over to you, though, I have a few technical announcements to make. We are aware of the fact that this issue is a very broad one and that you, our audience, might have quite a few questions for our speakers. You can submit them via the question function of the webinar cockpit. We will do our best to keep at least 20 to 30 minutes for a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. But that might not be enough to answer all of them. I'd like to apologize for this eventuality straight away. However, we shall brief our speakers on all unanswered questions after the end of the webinar. Also, the slides of the presentation will soon be available on our website for you to download. A big thank you to our speakers for agreeing to this. You shall receive a mail notifying you once they are available, and a video recording of this session will also soon be up in the members section of our website. If you should experience difficulties with the sound or the image, my advice for you would be to shut down the webinar plugin and to relaunch it by clicking the link in the notification mail you received this morning. One last thing before we start. At the end of the webinar, you will be asked to participate in a quick questionnaire, which consists of just 5 questions. You can skip that, of course, but if you participate, you will help us to improve our formats. And that's all from my side for now. Let's get started. Graham Beale, Andreas Graf, please take over. Have a great webinar, everyone.
Thank you very much, Sven, for your kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What I want to look at today is how emission reduction has been achieved in France and Germany since 2005 compared with the EU, and look how we can move forward to 2030. So what I'm bringing you are 4 new insights into the decarbonisation challenge and one aim. And these insights are the results of research work which has been undertaken at the Ruhr University earlier this year. So firstly, we want to show how emissions were reduced since 2005. What were the respective roles of renewables, energy demand reduction, and fuel switching? We're looking at Germany, France, the EU, and in each case, the leading country in each sector, the one which has achieved the most, to see what we can learn from that country. Secondly, with respect to reducing energy demand, we want to separate out the role of energy efficiency from the GDP impetus, and also the effect of global warming, which interestingly you will see is already reducing the space heating requirement. In the third place, I want to compare consumption-based emissions, which cover really the entire CO2 footprint for which a country is responsible, not only within its borders, but outside. I want to compare that with the production-based counterparts with which we're much more familiar. So by doing so, we can see the real emissions caused by natural consumption, including net trade, and also understand the extent to which reduction in emissions was partly achieved by deindustrialization. In the fourth place, and based on the above analysis, I want to assess how much effort is necessary to meet alternative 2030 targets in relation to the effort which has taken place between 2005 and 2018. And I have a single aim with all of this. It's that there should be realistic target setting, learning from best practice, and progressing rationally. So this first chart shows in two different ways how emissions have been reduced over this 13-year period. On the left-hand side, we're looking at emission reductions by sector. We've got the EU 28, followed by Germany, France, and the UK. And the first thing that we see is that whilst the UK may be a black sheep following the Brexit, in fact, it's been the most successful country in reducing its emissions. Since 2005, it reduced them by 30%. That was 50% more than the EU. France's reduction was roughly in line with the EU, and Germany's rather lower. You see next in the left-hand chart that for the EU, Germany, and the UK, most of the reduction came from the power sector. In France, you see that industry and buildings played a greater role. And in the UK, you see also that emission reduction in industry was quite important. Then if you look on the right-hand side, I believe I'm showing you something new, because what we've done at the Ruhr University is decompose the actual reduction in emissions which has taken place into, starting at the top of the legend, the reduction that's taken place by fuel switching, both in the final sector and the power sector, then renewables in the power sector, which is yellow, and in the other, and non-electric renewables, and then the extent to which reducing energy demand has contributed. Now, the single and the most important message that comes out of this, I think it's quite well known, but perhaps it hasn't been quantified before, is just how important renewables, and especially renewables power, have been. We see that for the EU as a whole. We see it in particularly for Germany, where at one level the country has been phenomenally successful in rolling out electric renewables. It's, however, has to be taken into account that the closure of the nuclear plants, shown in grey, has been offsetting quite a lot of this. And what's happened in the past will unfortunately remain a problem for the future. The reduction in final energy demand, which we see in blue, played the biggest role in the United Kingdom. Fuel switching, we see, played a relatively small role. So that sets out the overall picture I now want to look at individual sectors. First, I want to show how much has been, what proportion of the national emissions have been reduced and what remains. So you see in these charts, in blue, that shows the work that's been done between 2005 and 2018. And in orange, you see what still remains to be done. As I said a moment ago, most of the emissions reduction that's been achieved in the EU as a whole and in Germany came from the power sector. France have made higher contributions from industry and buildings. Emissions from the German coal sector at the end of 2018 represented around about 25% of total national emissions, but have since decreased materially. And the main point that comes out of this is that even if the power sector would be completely decarbonized, which over the course of time it will be, there's still a huge effort remaining in the final demand sector, where those emissions are over twice as high as the remaining emissions in the power sector. So it's important to work at the power sector, but we need to redouble our efforts in the other sectors. So I'm looking now at individual sectors, and instead of looking at the reduction of total national emissions, I'm looking at the emissions reductions in relation to the figures by sector for 2005. So the numbers look very different. So we see again in the left-hand graph that it was renewables playing the major role everywhere. We see the role of power demand reduction in the United Kingdom, and I think that really wants to be highlighted. The United Kingdom had, in my view, perhaps along with Sweden, some of the strongest policies in Europe, and they really worked hard to reduce energy demand. Excuse me, I see a message that I have possibly a problem with my internet connection. If
all's well for us.
All is well. Okay,
yeah.
good. So a superfluous message. Yes. So I think we really need to look and see how successful the United Kingdom was in reducing energy demand. In the industry sector, we can see a rather different picture. Renewables played a very small role, fuel switching a larger role. Reducing energy demand played the biggest role, but one needs to be careful there because, of course, some of this was through deindustrialization. Germany, on the other hand, actually increased its output from energy-intensive industries, and therefore the demand was increasing rather than reducing. So that was something that didn't help reduce the total emissions, but also it meant that Germany wasn't increasing its imports of energy-intensive goods. So we switch now to transport and buildings. So as we're all familiar, the transport sector has not been a big success story. For the EU as a whole, you can see that the modest role of renewables, which helped reduce emissions, was offset by increased demand because there were more and larger cars on the road. And one phenomenon, which of course is anything but helpful, is the high proportion of new SUVs which are being registered. We see in Germany that emissions increased rather than reduced, mainly because demand grew. In France, it was a bit more successful. Renewables played a greater role. But the country which was by far the most successful was Sweden, which has extraordinarily strong biofuels policies. It's important to be aware that a significant share of these biofuels are imported, and therefore it's unlikely that this powerful policy could be rolled out elsewhere. If we look at the building sector, we see that three factors have made roughly equal contributions to reducing emissions at the EU level in total. That's demand, renewables, and fuel switching. In Germany, there was hardly any fuel switching to record. Energy demand decreased more than in other countries. In France, energy demand decreased. But then if you look at France and Sweden, you see the huge contribution which fuel switching made. And this was fuel switching mainly to electricity, and in Sweden, in particular, for heat pumps. I want now to look at the trends in the annual growth rate of renewables. And I'm doing this for the EU 28 and for each country against the level of power demand in the year 2010. And as I think you're all aware, until the COVID-19 crisis came along this year, power demand has been relatively stable. So what we see working from the top down, the country which has consistently performed best is Denmark, with a growth rate of 3.5% renewables in relation to its final electricity demand. For Germany, the rate has been moving up, but the big problem for the EU as a whole is that the rate has been moving in the wrong direction. For France, the rate has been moving up, albeit from a low level. On the right-hand side, you can see the same figures for wind power, with Germany showing a good upward trend, but of course this trend now is being broken as a result of the great difficulty in getting acceptance for onshore wind. And just today I saw that the latest auction announced by the Bundesnetzagentur showed no projects being offered for onshore wind. So as I said at the beginning of my presentation, the results of our analysis show that renewables is by far and away the most important vector in decarbonizing, in particular power renewables. The trend for Europe at the moment is going in the wrong way, and to meet the ambitious targets, we really need to redouble our efforts. This briefly shows the contributions of renewables to reducing emissions in the final energy sector, where you see in industry modest contributions in Germany and Sweden. Transport, France and Sweden are doing better, and in the building sector, Germany and Italy are the two leading countries. If we then look at fuel switching, we can see that it's France and Sweden where most of the fuel switching is taking place. That's in industry, not so much in transport, but in particular in the building sector. And the explanation, of course, is well known. It's the high power prices in Germany, which is making electricity uncompetitive, and the very low power prices in Sweden and France, which have the big advantage of a lot of nuclear power and of hydropower, and not having loaded their consumer tariffs with high surcharges. So this really underlines the problem facing Germany. It's suffering from a huge disadvantage with, as I see it, no easy solution to reduce the power prices. This chart shows the role of energy demand reduction to reducing emissions in the final sector, and in industry, as already mentioned, you see in France and the UK, you've got strong contributions there, but it's not just efficiency measures, but it's the fact that the countries are producing less and importing more. Interestingly, and perhaps surprisingly, Germany is in the leading position in Europe in the building sector, despite struggling with renovation rates, which I think all countries are. What I want to do next, and very briefly, is to attempt to disaggregate the reduction in energy demand into three elements. the role of GDP, which of course is driving it forwards the whole time, the role of global warming, which is seen here in heating degree days, which is reducing the demand for heating, and lastly, efficiency. So I'm looking at the power sector here, and you see, particularly in Denmark, there's been very good progress with efficiency, preventing the power demand growing as much as might have been the case. But overall, it's important that we're aware that efficiency is working well in the background. In the final energy demand sector, we can see efficiency and GDP roughly balancing each other, with helpful contributions from global warming in the EU as a whole, more in Germany, small ones in France, none at all in the UK, where the average temperatures, believe it or not, haven't changed over 13 years. So I particularly want to emphasize the way in which efficiency is working to prevent power demand from growing as much as would otherwise have been the case. It's important to bear this in mind in our future demand forecasts. In the third place now, I want to bring you a simple analysis comparing production-based emission figures. They're the ones with which we're all familiar. So comparing those with consumption-based estimates, which are available from a very interesting organization called Our World in Data. So a number of messages. My purpose in presenting this, of course, is it's our consumption footprint which determines the total global emissions which result from our behavior, our choices, and so on, not just within our borders, but outside. So if we look at Germany first, we can see the consumption figures are slightly higher than the production figures. We can see for France, the difference is bigger. We can see for the EU 11 that the difference is around about 20%. But one of the most interesting things to emerge from this analysis is the following, and you see that at the right-hand side. You see the range for production-based figures is quite large. The range for consumption-based figures is considerably smaller, and that reflects the fact, of course, that the consumption patterns of different EU countries, we're looking here at the EU 11, that covers 85% of European GDP, and it's the countries for which the figures were available. So the range is much smaller. But because there are big differences, this underlines, in my view, the pressing need for a consumption-based approach, despite its challenges. The challenges, of course, are that one is having to estimate what the carbon content is of net imports, but it gives a much more realistic picture of what our real carbon footprint is. If you look at the next chart, you can see the extent to which emissions reduction between 2005 and 2017 took place on a consumption basis and a production basis. And so the countries are sequenced in descending order based on the reduction in consumption basis of emissions. If we look at France, we can see it did less well on a production base, on a consumption basis than a production basis. On the other hand, if we look at Germany, and Germany badly needs to polish up its emission figures, emission reduction figures, which are certainly less healthy than the country would wish for, and it can do so with this important piece of information, that on a consumption basis, it has reduced its emissions more than the headline production basis shows. So I hope you find that interesting. That certainly adds insight to what's actually happened. Perhaps we just pick out one more country, the United Kingdom, and you see on a production basis, an independent observer would think the UK's done really well. However, if you then look on a consumption basis, there's still a reduction in emissions, but it's not as strong as the production-based figures suggest. So lastly, and building on this analysis, I want to show the route to 2030 in 4 different cases. And my purpose in doing this is to plead for realism, that we don't get ambitious targets plucked out of the air, if I can put it like this, without having a good plan as to how the targets could be reached. So we've got 4 different cases which are shown in the table below. The first case is, the first case is a simple extrapolation of the annual average effort which we had between 2005 and 2018 in building renewables and energy efficiency. So no extra effort. This way, by 2030, we wouldn't reduce emissions by 40%, but only by 35%. Then taking that case with a COVID-19 dividend, assuming 10% less energy in the transport sector and 2.5% in the industrial sector, still the same effort between 2005 and 2018, then we would achieve minus 37%. So with that assumption, and of course one can debate how big the COVID dividend will be. This analysis was done a few months ago. I think seeing the extent to which people are getting used to working at home and reducing business travel, perhaps 10% reduction was a bit conservative. It might be more, but in any event, it's not going to be what we need to meet more ambitious targets. So if one wants to meet the minus 40% target, then according to our calculation, one would have to increase the effort in building renewables and efficiency by 20%. If you want to meet the minus 55% target, then you'd have to increase the effort by 100%. So that means exactly doubling what was achieved between 2005 and 2018. And these charts show in 2 different ways. Firstly, the contributions from different sectors, and secondly, the contributions from the different levers, from renewables, reducing energy demand, and fuel switching. And it may surprise you that the contribution from renewables isn't greater, but this, please, is a net contribution after allowing for the expected closures of nuclear power plants, not just in Germany, but in other countries, and also allowing for the taking out of service first generation renewables plants which need replacing. So I can't emphasize strongly enough how important it is to push out with renewables power building, and just how much work there is to be done in order to meet the kind of targets which are being discussed. In that context, it's important that we are aware of what the merit order is for the application of incremental renewables power. If I've got an additional megawatt hour of renewables power, I can do different things with it, but these different things lead to very different reductions in emissions. So just looking at the chart from left to right, if I replace coal, existing coal-fired plants, then depending upon what the efficiency is, that's the best thing that I can do with renewables. If I replace gas-fired plants, it doesn't achieve so much. If I use renewables for electric cars or for heat pumps, that delivers a similar benefit to replacing coal-fired plants. But then if I use electricity, in industry to replace fossil fuels, that doesn't achieve so much. And what unfortunately achieves least of all is using renewables electricity to produce hydrogen because of the, amongst other things, because of the energy losses and because there are no gearing benefits. There are huge mathematical gearing benefits in replacing motor fuels in an internal combustion engine with renewables electricity. There are huge gearing benefits in heat pumps. Unfortunately, you don't have any of those gearing benefits in hydrogen. So lastly, I have 6 headline messages for governments, and I hope that these can play into the discussion that we have later. Firstly, and very obviously, make absolute maximum efforts to accelerate the build out of renewables power. It has achieved 75% of the emissions reduction since 2005. And then giving you some more detail about what I said a moment ago, up to 2030, so from 2019 to 2030, 330 terawatt hours of nuclear and first generation renewables will be closed, twice the level that was closed from 2005 to 2018. Therefore, before electric renewables are making any net contribution, they need to compensate for these closures. The current average building rates of 46 terawatt hours a year are far too low. The second point, this applies particularly to Germany, is to keep electricity prices competitive. It's absolutely crucial to ensure electrification. We've seen the most fuel switching in the countries with low electricity prices, especially France and Sweden. And those countries may become magnets for electricity intensive industry in the future if other countries don't manage to reduce their electricity prices. And Germany, as I see it, is in a serious trap with its high electricity prices and further loss of zero carbon nuclear power. The policies to reduce energy demand for manufactured products through recycling and so on needs strengthening. Demand reduction has only played a small role so far, but it's going to be absolutely crucial in decarbonising industry. And we must be careful not to be misled by some of the current results for industry. They can be misleading in that they result more from deindustrialisation. In my view, we need to introduce a carbon border tax because there are trends, unfavourable trends in consumption-based emissions, which show a progressive increase of net trade in energy-intensive products. I was in discussion with one of the cement manufacturers recently, and he said, taking Europe as a whole, if you look at the eastern borders, more and more cement is coming in from outside those countries. Then, in the fifth place, set targets which are realistic based on possible renewables growth and efficiency measures. And remember that to meet the minus 55% target in 2030 would require an exact doubling of what was achieved between 2005 and 2018, when there was quite a lot of low-hanging fruit which has been harvested. And lastly, and this draws attention to a clear dilemma, apply incremental units of renewables power where they deliver the highest emission dividends. And as I said, their use for hydrogen production reduces emissions by much less compared with their use in electric cars and heat pumps. But Europe needs to gain experience with hydrogen and to reduce the production costs. So this, as I see it, is a difficult dilemma which we're facing. We need to make strike the right balance to make sure that incremental units of renewables are well used, but that also we move down the learning curve with electrolyzers and hydrogen production, so that in the course of time it can play the necessary role in decarbonizing industry. Thank you very much for your kind attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Graham Veal, for this interesting and very complete presentation that gives us a lot to think about. We have received some messages remarking typing noises, so maybe we could try to avoid these during the Q&A session, I'm afraid. Coming up next, we have Andreas Graf from Agora Energiewende with his assessment, which we are very much looking forward to. And for our audience, please do not hesitate to continue to send us your questions. Andreas Graf, if you please.
Apologies, I hadn't unmuted myself. So many thanks, Sven, and many thanks, Graham, for your initial presentation, which I think is very useful for our discussion afterwards as well. Having seen Graham's presentation in advance, I decided that I would try to reinforce some of his messages in my presentation, but also provide a few additional perspectives on this discussion. And when looking at the conversation around higher ambition for climate and how realistic it is to reach them, it struck me that there are essentially three basic stories that are told when it comes to this discussion. There's a fourth,
Andreas,
and that
I'm
is
very sorry to interrupt you, but we still have those typing noises. I'm really sorry. I don't know if I don't see on my screen any mics open except yours, but could anyone who is just typing right now please double check if they have their mics open? Thank you very much. Andreas, please.
Thank you, Sven. So the fourth story that I'm not going to be telling today is the one that I think should all take for as a given joining this conversation, which is the urgency of climate change and the need to do as much as possible as quickly as possible. So with this as a given, I'd like to begin with the first story, so to say, namely the dramatic and revolutionary changes we're seeing currently on climate ambition. So just as a scene setter again, of course, we're seeing quite a sea change in the scale of ambition and the speed of ambition, driven largely by three basic elements. First, the Paris Agreement having been agreed in 2015 and ratified in 2016. Which then over time led to the commitment of the EU to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. And following the European Parliament elections, the announcement of the European Green Deal, which is really moving things forward. And I think most notably, we're seeing this from, and the reason why we're here today, is that 55% and higher climate ambition has become the focus of EU climate policy discussions, and perhaps surprisingly, based on the fact that we had just concluded negotiations, long legislative negotiations on a clean energy package just in the last Commission, agreeing to new renewable energy targets, new energy efficiency targets. So we are moving forward on the scale of ambition, and a decision is indeed expected by December, something that was not necessarily clear when the target discussion was first announced. We are also seeing that member states are really moving forward in parallel to the EU discussion. So countries from Austria to Sweden have announced very significant climate targets, perhaps the most notable being Denmark, which has announced the goal of reducing its emissions 70% by 2030. We are seeing initial discussions as to how to respond to higher climate ambition at the EU level in France and Germany. Those commitments have not yet though been made, but we are seeing higher ambition at the national level across several member states. And we are also seeing important decisions that that signal quite significant changes when it comes to our energy consumption. Things that I think were not to be expected a decade ago. Things like targets across much of Western Europe for fossil fuel internal combustion engine phase-outs by 2030 or 2040 at the latest in different countries across the EU. But similarly, we're actually seeing first targets to phase out fossil fuel consumption in for heating in buildings. And just as a note of to indicate how significant some of these targets could be, actually 40% of the exports of German passenger vehicles are actually to countries that have already announced bans. And finally, we're seeing kind of the commitment to net zero by 2050 being followed by countries across the world. The most notable example recently having been China with a commitment to carbon neutrality by 2060, but also followed by South Korea, Japan, and with the new Biden administration, we would actually see more than 3/5 of global CO2 emissions under net zero targets. So these are very significant changes, so these, I think, do very clearly indicate a sea change in the level of ambition that we have at EU level, at global level, in terms of climate action. So the second story that will then frequently come up is, well, how realistic is this? And I think we heard some of the concerns as to the pace of change happening already reflected in Graham Wheel's presentation. But here's some further thoughts from my side. So just as a reminder, despite all of these announcements, in terms of the concrete policies that have been announced so far, we are nowhere near on track for staying below the 1.5 degrees Celsius target announced in the Paris Agreement. While the announcement of China and other countries to move more strongly towards net zero give us a much stronger position to actually move towards this target. The global carbon budget to remain below this temperature target is also very quickly being used up. We are also in a situation where the policies so far committed at EU level do not add up yet to the 55%. Of course, this shouldn't be surprising. If we're only now talking about increasing ambition, then why would policies already be in place? But I think this is quite just important to underline that we have a significant gap. Based on the calculations of the European Commission, looking at what it would take, what emissions reductions would be achieved if the EU's renewable energy and efficiency targets would be met, and looking at the national energy and climate plans of member states, we see a gap of roughly 10% at the moment. The 55% target, I think also well reflected in Graham Wheel's presentation, also means a very, very significant upscaling of investment, something beyond historical levels. You see in the picture on the right, for example, in blue, the historical investments from 2011 to 2020 in these different sectors, and in beige and in green, the additional investments that would needed for the committed targets and the higher ambition targets. So we were talking about a significant upscaling of investment. And if we look at the EU budget deal from July alone, and that budget negotiation has not yet been concluded, it clearly does not close the gap on its own. Higher ambition would also mean higher carbon pricing. one of the leading instruments that will be used to drive further climate action will be a reform of the EU emissions trading system. Essentially, over the last decade, the EU emissions trading system has played a very limited role in driving climate action compared to other instruments. And the prices have hovered around €5 per ton of CO2 for much of that decade. Looking forward, though, we anticipate a range of potential CO2 prices that are much more significant and really do raise, again, a more serious concern about carbon leakage, as has already been reflected from historical data in Graham Wheel's presentation. Higher ambition will also mean that some member states will be more able to invest in clean energy infrastructure than others, given for different reasons, different starting points, but also their basic economic starting point. And so higher ambition will also mean that we will need to develop EU solidarity mechanisms to actually help poorer member states contribute to higher ambition. Richer member states in the EU will clearly be required to do relatively more towards our common objective, but there will also need to be support to poorer member states to be able to move their economies towards net zero, so that we can, as a continent, achieve net zero by 2050. But despite, I think, this sobering picture, there is very much actually a case for a realistic optimism that was not told based on the historical data that Graham Wheel has shown today. The first is, I think we very much actually, in the 2030 perspective, know what needs to be done. And I think many of the reflections of Graham Wheel reflect that. And this is just an example of kind of a study result from a report that we brought out for how Germany can reach climate neutrality by 2050. And based on the different technologies available, we have a clear indication of where investment should be headed. So we really know what needs to be done. We also know that emissions have reduced quite quickly in some of the more difficult to decarbonize sectors, and we have historical precedent to know how to move things even faster than they have in the past. And I think Sweden is one of the best examples, largely or especially for the buildings sector, having achieved really quite dramatic emissions reductions over the last decades. I think it should be noted that many of these emissions reductions in Sweden were essentially the result not initially of climate action, but rather a reaction to the oil price shocks in the 70s and 80s, but they led to a rethinking of how to move forward in terms of heating in Sweden that have really, I think, paved the way for emissions reductions in the sector. And we also have not always actually identified the trends with key technologies in the past very accurately. So this makes looking at historical data actually quite misleading, but it also indicates that we really should be humble to how quickly certain technology developments can develop. On the left, you see some of the forecasts of leading experts and organizations with regards to solar costs over time. And on the right, you see the expected development of solar power capacity in the IEA forecasts over the years. And essentially, in both cases, they have been revised year on year in the past decade. Solar is perhaps the best example, but there are likely to be more in the future. And as a result, we have also seen a radical decline of prices for some of these key clean energy technologies over the last decade, from PV as solar photovoltaic as just shown, to wind technologies, and these are both a function of technological development and deployment. But they show us that if higher ambition means that more emissions reductions will have to come in the future, that this is also something that can be expected based on technological development. And just to belabor the point, a third case in point, many of technological developments actually do not take place in a linear fashion. They take place actually in a quite more radical way, namely in something that technology diffusion scholars call the S-curve. And here you see several examples of different technologies that didn't develop or deploy into their markets in a moderate fashion, but rather they came one day and they were there to stay the next, essentially. And while we should be also humble in how many of the technologies we need will be able to deploy in this fashion, I think some of the key technologies might come quite a bit quicker than we expect. And so we may actually marvel at how quickly we can deploy clean technologies. And on the left, you see actually the EV market, the electric vehicle market in Norway. I think something that is sometimes forgotten, that there are countries in the world that are already well on their way to electrifying transport, with Norway having a share of battery and plug-in hybrid over or close to 80% at this point in time in new vehicle registrations. We also have on the right, again, the example of Sweden that has seen a radical shift in its heating sector over the last decades. And when it comes again to also the political ambition and the merging of kind of technology choices and policy ambition, we may also marvel at how some of the irresolvable problems of the past in terms of the choices we make may become yesterday's news. And perhaps one of the best examples is the coal phase-out discussions that have taken place in Europe over the last years. And of course, these coal phase-out discussions do not mean that coal is being taken off the grid from one year to the next across Europe. But whereas in 2016, we didn't have many cases of clear commitments to phase out coal, this year we see already commitments across most of Europe, with some countries remaining, but also very few countries today also failing to recognize that coal will be probably the key emissions reduction potential over the next decade. We also have tools to deal with carbon leakage, and there are different ways of dealing this, and they all come with intense political discussions. But already today, we have a framework for free allocation under the EU emissions trading system. But we also have other instruments that we can transition to over time. This includes a carbon border adjustment, as Graham Wheel presented. But it also includes instruments to support the deployment of low carbon technologies so that we're actually investing into the green energy technologies as opposed to moving away from our dirty technologies only. And I think over time, we will also not want to stop or remain at a carbon border adjustment, but rather move much more towards green standards, essentially using the power of the EU internal market to demand that products that come onto the market are clean, full stop, and to use then the power of the EU market to green production across the world. We also see the technologies in energy intensive industry for real breakthrough emissions reductions already available. Perhaps the best example being the hybrid project in Sweden, which is now already starting significant pilot operations for emissions-free steel at the moment. But we're also seeing a similar direct reduction of iron technology investments being made across Europe, and investment announcements that signal that we could really dramatically reduce emissions from our conventional technologies in energy intensive sectors. So while our emissions have been stagnating in industry as opposed to reducing and going in the direction that we need them, we also know we have the investment, the technologies we need to actually take make a step change in these sectors. And finally, we also have a clear indication of European leaders that they are, I think, genuinely committed to ensuring that the EU budget and the new next generation EU recovery funds are actually spent on green growth. And especially in international perspective, they are putting their money where their mouth is and committing to significant investments in the clean economy, investments that will hopefully also accelerate movement in towards our 55% goal. We also have, I think, perhaps actually the clearest signal on this front, a commitment also of the European Commission to legislate beyond the current framework. So in its work program, the European Commission has announced a Fit for 55 package that will be largely presented mid next year in June 2021. Some files will come after June 2021, but by the end of the year. And so we are looking to a very significant upscaling of ambition also in concrete legislative files. So with that, I just wanted to present an impulse to present these different perspectives from where we stand on ambition, the very kind of sobering picture on where we stand today, but also the very hopeful picture about how we can significantly scale up ambition so that in the future we can, I think, move solidly towards 55% in upscaling ambition and not be halted by the historic progress we have made.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for your presentation that fits rather nicely with Graham Wheel's presentation, and that gives us a very nice basis for our discussion. Now, we received some questions. You can still send us yours, of course, from the audience, and we still have half an hour left to discuss. Now, we received several questions about something that I would structure around carbon pricing, carbon leakage, and imported CO2 emissions. Would you maybe like to describe your position on that? We have seen in Germany that CO2 pricing for the non-ETS is coming next year. In France, it has already been running for quite a while. What would be the impact on the emissions of the global system? And do you think, or how do you assess the risk of carbon leakage? Maybe Graham Wheel first. I think, yes, now your mic is on.
Yes, thank you for these questions. Both Andreas Graf and myself have referenced Sweden quite a lot. Neither of us, I think, have mentioned that Sweden introduced a carbon price, I believe, going back to 1990. It's now reached 100 euros a ton. Of course, it's levied in such a way so that it doesn't add to the burden from the emissions trading scheme. That has definitely contributed to Sweden's success in decarbonising the industrial sector and the household sector. So as an economist, I would like to see price-based progress, but also with some of the hard experience that I had when I was chief economist of RWE, and everyone was expecting that carbon prices would be moving north strongly, and that 30 euros would absolutely have been the floor. And then the global recession came along and the carbon prices collapsed. There needs to be a reliable basis for investment, and even the kind of carbon prices that we're seeing at the moment, they're much lower than some of the implicit carbon costs, the necessary carbon costs for decarbonizing industry. So I think carbon pricing is part of the story, but because of its uncertainty and maybe some unwanted side effects, it's not enough to do the whole job. Over time, the world has to get used to paying more for goods. And just picking up one point that Andreas Graf made, he said, the European Commission, individual countries may be legislating for green products. If they do so, they need to be aware of just how expensive some of those green products might be. And at the moment, if you want green aluminium, for example, I'm in contact with the local aluminium industry in Essen. They get frequent requests for green aluminium. When they tell them how much it would cost, the requests quickly disappear. So to summarize, carbon pricing is important. It's good that Germany introduced the scheme starting next year, and good that it was quickly increased from 10 to 25 euros, and then moves up, I think, to 55 euros by 2025. That's only the first step, and over time, Europe has to get used to much higher carbon prices. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham Wheel. Andreas, maybe on this question, and also maybe your assessment of how big you assess the risk of carbon leakage following the introduction of carbon prices.
Yes, thank you. Let me first just briefly react to something that Graham said on the cost of green aluminium, because I think this is important. Indeed, transitioning to greener technologies often does mean an incremental cost higher than conventional technologies. If they weren't higher, we would be doing them already. So then the question becomes, are they so much higher that we as a society cannot afford them? And in this case, also the question, the answer is clearly no. When it comes to, for example, aluminium, the producer might find the cost of paying 100 euros or more per ton of aluminium more than the conventional technology too expensive. But in the cost for the consumer, in, for example, a car, if you're using this aluminium to produce a car, they might only have a higher cost of 100 euros or 150 euros, costs that go under in the overall cost of a vehicle, where often many of our choices as consumers are actually completely irrational. when we choose to have to purchase a much more expensive fuel inefficient car like an SUV rather than a smaller car. But also we make choices based on luxury and other considerations. So the question then becomes, how can we finance this? And there, of course, there have to be ways in which there is actually an expectation that these costs can be recovered. And there are different ways of doing that. This can be just the demand of the consumer in terms of wanting greener products. We're not yet seeing, let's say, the willingness of consumers to simply buy lots of green car door vehicles at a higher price, but we can also mandate this. We can simply say car manufacturers need to have a certain quota of green aluminium, and then they can, different producers can compete to produce this at the lowest cost. We can support the producers of green aluminium in other ways and cover the costs in other ways. So there are different ways of financing this, but I think in the end, we shouldn't get hung up on this question of, is it too expensive? Because in the end, it really is not too expensive, given the importance of urgent climate action and, let's say, the very limited additional costs that it actually means. So when it comes to carbon leakage, I think we really need to have a conversation that is honest about these considerations. So in the past, we have had, again, a carbon price of 5 to 10 euros for most of the last decade. And under those circumstances, the discussion around carbon leakage based on the ETS, which was very exaggerated. And so we came to the point where some economists and scholars have even said carbon leakage doesn't exist. It is not possible. It's not happening based on historical data. But I think it's quite evident that at prices of 50 euros plus, the impact on competitiveness of individual products, as I've just mentioned, and the cost difference to clean products, et cetera, it grows. And so we need to take these factors seriously. And they will also be important in getting the political buy-in to really commit to 55%. So I think, however, that if we use the instruments we have on hand, and I presented a few during my presentation, we create a framework for actually investing into clean products and the actual technologies in energy-intensive industry that are compatible with climate neutrality, then we can manage this task.
Thank you very much. A second field of questions structures around decarbonizing by electrifying, and if we look at the situation today, we see that of course, in the energy mix, that electricity accounts for 20%. But if in the long term, this will have to become 100% of the energy consumed, we have to look at the situation today on what concerns the targets and also the installation rates of renewable energies. Graham Wheel and Andreas Graf also highlighted that this is not necessarily easygoing at the moment in Germany and France. So what would you suggest? What are the key problems here? And how could we go about resolving this problem most efficiently?
Okay, if I may start with that.
Of course.
I think already we are seeing some kind of a battle between where the energy vendor needs to go and what's acceptable. And I'm thinking in particular of the big struggle which there is to build the necessary electric motorways from the north to the south of Germany. The progress there is lamentably slow. And as obviously others have, I've been thinking a great deal about the challenge. And I think it comes down to stronger and stronger laws of different types. So Andreas was saying a moment ago, well, the European Union could mandate green cars and could mandate other things. So that's already a step up the legal ladder. One's introducing tighter laws. Probably those particular laws could be passed without too much difficulty. But if one starts with what geographically is possible in terms of the areas of Germany and France or Europe for wind production and what's actually being accepted, there's a big dichotomy. I said in my presentation, I gave you the fresh, hot off the press information that the Bundesnetzagentur announced this morning that whereas there'd been offers for biomass and solar projects, there hadn't been for wind projects. So the question is, how tough does legislation have to get if there are areas of land or areas of the sea which are suitable for wind or solar generation, but at the moment it's being resisted? And I see it, unfortunately, as a rather difficult battle between the two sides for other reasons. Of course, recently against the background of the COVID-19 crisis, the question has been asked in Germany very much, what are the limits of the constitution? What can actually be required and what can't be required? So I see big issues there. I also see big issues in decarbonizing industry and the existing state aid laws in Brussels. I'm pleased to hear that the discussion is getting underway, but at the moment, I see it as absolutely impossible that the targets for industry could be met whilst maintaining the same state aid laws. So in a nutshell, I see the challenge is to strengthen laws, to force certain things to happen, which people might not like because they're too close to their back door or they're spoiling the environment. What we have to understand is we can't have the necessary Energiewende and meet the desired or the necessary climate targets without considerable inconvenience and sacrifices of quite a wide range. And I think the discussion needs to be focused much more on that, to condition voters to understand, okay, they say it's right that we should aim for zero emissions, but that's going to involve changes to our lifestyle and things that make us uncomfortable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we see that the condition of what we consider to be a normal environment, or what an environment should be like, ideally will have to evolve. Andreas Graf, do you share that point of view? Do you think that we've seen in your presentation that was very clear that the evolution of installed renewable capacities is not a price issue? It is. What do you share Graham Wheel's view that it's an acceptability issue?
So I do think that we will be investing in a lot of infrastructure over the next decades, and some of those will be very large built infrastructure that will have kind of a significant impact on a local area, but will be restricted to industrial cluster areas that are already quite unappealing visually. And then there will be some more decentralized investments across the entire continent that will, I think, mean a significant change in the landscape, but over time. And we have seen many infrastructure changes over the last decades and centuries, of course, from our highways and large electricity transportation networks to many other elements. But you know, will it mean a change? Very clearly, yes. Is it something that cannot be managed? No, and I think there are we're increasingly aware of different ways of managing issues of acceptance, from having different local jurisdictions participate in the benefits of renewables deployment in terms of tax income, to making sure that we minimize the impact on those in the surrounding areas. And the earlier we start, the more likely we are to really be able to manage such a process while taking into consideration all of these acceptance concerns and managing them in a robust way.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe just a question evolving from this. As renewables are becoming more and more competitive price-wise, do you see any business model for another technology if we go more and more towards financing via markets to renewables for the energy production in the future? Andreas, maybe first.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, if you look at the price evolution of renewable energies in the recent years, do you, and if we see also the struggle it is to roll them out, do you think that it will be sufficient to work with renewables? Do you think that there will evolve a business case for other technologies?
Well, I think if the question is, will we have a 100% renewable energy system?
Yes.
In the future, if I boil it down to that, then I think maybe we should look at what a transition to that world could look like, and why there could be other technologies or not. So looking out into, let's say, 2050, just for the argument, we are likely to see a transition in the power sector by 2030 away from coal very significantly, with most scenarios that we are looking at showing that coal essentially exits the energy system in Europe by 2030 already. This leaves still a share of nuclear power production in Europe. It also leaves still significant fossil gas production. And towards 2050 then, the question will be, how do you want to get those last 10% of your emissions in the power sector removed, and how do you want to manage the system over time? And we can envision a future in which it is 100% renewables, with direct renewable production or direct electrification with renewables on the one hand, and indirect electrification with renewables in the form of renewable hydrogen on the other, balancing the system. I think let's first focus on 2030. where I think we have a much clearer picture of where the story is going, and this is phasing out coal by 2030. Probably not an expansion of nuclear by 2030, given the kind of the scale of a challenge in investing and expanding a nuclear fleet in that period. I know France is having this discussion, parts of Eastern Europe are having that conversation, but they will not play a significant role in the 2030 timeframe. And how can we start to have a framework that transitions us away from fossil gas and towards green hydrogen, renewable hydrogen production? Those are, I think, the questions I would focus on rather than what is the potential future in 2050. We have quite a ways to go in reaching that intermediate milestone.
Thank you very much. Graham Veal, any views on this?
Yes. The two particular challenges which stick out for me at the moment are how to bring the cost of batteries and electrolyzers down the learning curve. There are grounds for being more optimistic about batteries because of the increase in electric cars that's being rolled out, but for them really to be available at utility scale and to complement a continually rising renewables share, the costs need to come down more. The bigger problem is electrolyzers. And right at the end of my presentation, I really highlighted the big dilemma that at the moment, using marginal units of renewable energy for hydrogen production won't reduce emissions as much as doing other things. So who is going to put up money so we gain experience and we get down the learning curve in the same way that we did for photovoltaic cells and wind turbines? And until someone's got an answer to that question, then I struggle to see how we're going to get the production of hydrogen down as much as necessary. Perhaps it's worth adding, for those who aren't aware, Germany has this Real Labore project or group of 20 projects. I've been in contact with a number of the project leaders, and quite a lot of them, they've developed the technology. They say the learning curve or the technology learning is there, but what's needed now is the learning curve in terms of the legal side, the changes to the structure of power prices and things like that. So I don't see there's an issue of a new business model. I think the business models of the power companies around the world are working very well, and one's seeing how they are becoming more popular with their shareholders and with communities as a whole. So I think they're on the right track. The remaining challenge is how can we build enough renewables? And I'm not sure that it's the cost that is the real problem. It's the availability of land space. And whilst the technology for the individual units is coming down, of course, as they get squeezed into land, which may be more expensive or further from the shore, then for other reasons, the costs will start increasing. So that's what I think we need to focus on.
Thank you. Yeah, I remarked that in your earlier statement, and I thought of Churchill and his blood, sweat, and tears at that moment. So maybe one day politicians will have to tell some truth to their voters and to put them in the right context in order to get those plants built at the price that they will cost. Maybe something on consumption. We saw in both your presentations that this was a big problem where many struggle to advance. What would be your take on the recent increase in the ambitions of the European Union for the industry, for example? Do you think that realistic, and how can we go about making it realistic? Maybe Andreas?
Yeah, I mean, let me just briefly start by reacting to this comment on blood, sweat, and tears, because I think that's again kind of an over dramatization of this situation in terms of cost, at least. I mean, when we look at what it would cost to produce hydrogen to, for example, decarbonize steel, we're talking about several kind of dozens of billions of incremental cost for clean steel production, for very, very significant emissions reductions, and in the grand scheme of things, these are small costs. It might sound like a lot, but in the end, blood, sweat, and tears is a bit of an exaggeration when it comes to the scale of our economy. And I think we have on hydrogen indeed a long way to go. I think it's important to highlight that. If you look at the type of projects that can really be considered renewable hydrogen projects that are on the market today, then we're talking about some 60 megawatts based on a recent Hydrogen Europe report, and where the EU wants to go in its EU hydrogen strategy is 40 gigawatts. It's a 700-fold increase by 2030. This is quite the ambitious scale, and that's just the capacity for production in terms of electrolyzer capacity. If you consider all of the renewable electricity that would have to be built out to also fuel that capacity, it's significant. However, I think it's a very, the question, can the costs come down? Well, that's how you would bring them down. That is the scale of deployment that will bring down costs in the period after 2030 to a point where they really are competitive elements of a decarbonized energy system, and can with kind of new frameworks also drive significant emissions reductions. And so I think I think we're doing the right things, we're sending the right signals, and we're looking in the right direction. Whether member states will actually back their commitments with actions has yet to be seen. But I think we're moving in the right direction, and it is not blood, sweat, and tears. This is a very manageable project from that perspective.
Right, thank you very much, Andreas, for this uplifting view. As I look, I'm looking at my watch, and I realize that we're heading straight to 11:30. So maybe a quick answer from Graham Beale, and then one final quick question for you both.
I think Frau Hildegard Müller, who's the chief executive of the Automotive Producers Association in Germany, hit the nail on the head. She said, and of course she's got considerable political experience herself, it's not helpful if the European Commission set out targets without explaining how these targets can be met. So whether we're looking at minus 55% or minus 60%, which the parliaments are calling for, we want to see a good political process at the European level. We want to see a good political process in France and in Germany. And the organization under which this discussion is being held represents the industry ministries of both countries. It's not healthy if we have figures taken, to say taken out of the air would be unfair, but headline figures set out without explaining how they can be reached. That said, I'm all for stretching people. In the course of my energy career, I've seen challenges that were set, and at the outset it was said, well, these can't possibly be met. But on the other hand, we've gone a long way along the learning curve now. We've got a great deal of experience with renewables. So my concluding remark is, let us set emission targets in line with what is possible if we push as hard as we can to grow out renewables. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. And that was a very nice transition to our final questions. And I would really ask you to give us a brief answer on that. It is one question that was asked several times about the benefit of setting more realistic goals, maybe. And on the other hand, what would be the penalties of not reaching the current 2030 goals? Graham Will, if you want.
Okay, the benefit of more realistic goals. We've got a better framework for planning, and if there's going to be a problem, let's say that we should be at minus 60% by 2030, but we can't, then, well, perhaps we look and see what can be done instead. Sorry, your second question, Sven, was?
What would be the penalties for a country of not reaching the current 2030 targets?
Well, the reduction at the moment in emissions is divided, of course, between two regimes: the emissions trading scheme and the effort sharing directive. And it's known what the financial penalties are. One can look at penalties in two ways. One can look at the penalties which can be administratively imposed by governments. Whether they end up being paid, I don't know. At the moment, at least before COVID-19 came along, Germany was facing a fine of some 300 million, I believe, because it hadn't adequately delivered on its effort sharing targets. That's the penalty in one sense. In the much wider context, there's a much more serious penalty. What does it mean for the planet and the Earth if Europe, as one of several important actors, isn't on track to meet its targets? And that's perhaps the question that should be given greater priority. And then one needs to make the connection between that and where we're actually progressing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andreas, final remarks on this?
Yes. So I would just comment that I think the discussion about how high we want to reach is really an important one, and everything our research shows that while very ambitious, 55% target is achievable if we put our plans in place and we start acting now. And I think the positive news is that many indicators show that policy leaders are taking this seriously and moving us in the right direction. On the question of should we have quote unquote realistic goals or goals that move us far beyond what appears realistic, I think so. Despite already having said that we actually think that 55% is realistic, there is a value in higher ambition in its own, because I think from this discussion, again, as I've tried to highlight, what seems possible changes over time, and this is often referred to as the Overton window, that simply by aiming for more and changing the framework in which we perceive the problem to be, we actually find new solutions, and we are able to move faster than we ever thought possible. And I think this is a clear example where 55% is possible. It is, I think, asking us to move further than many people think is realistic. But I think it will also force us to reflect on different things and realize that we can move faster once the initial investments have been made. We will see cost reductions coming down quicker than expected. We will see opportunities more clearly than we did in the past. And in the end, in 5 years' time, 55% will not seem so distant.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for this final statement. So we see the race for 2030 is still up. And if I summarize what you said, we're not allowed to lose it. So we better stick to the task of getting things done and decarbonizing the usages of energy. And I'm very sorry that we have already to conclude, because we are at 11:35 now, and this is already the end of this webinar. Thank you ever so much, Graham Veal and Andreas Graf, for these interesting presentations and this very vivid discussion. Many thanks also to Anna and Markus from our team for preparing this webinar, and to Celine for the technical coordination today. Before we sign off, just a few announcements. Coming up next at the Franco-German Office, we have 2 conferences before the end of the year. On December 2nd, an online conference on photovoltaics and self-consumption in France and Germany. And on December 8th, a political morning debate on the sectoral integration of the future energy system, objectives, means and regulations. Do make sure that you are on our mailing lists to stay updated on our upcoming conferences and our program for 2021. You can register for our conferences and webinars on our website, ofate.eu or dfbev.eu, where you will also find today's slides and many interesting publications for you to download and read during your Christmas holidays. And this is all from my side for now. Thank you very much for tuning in today and being with us. Please do stay safe. See you very soon. Bye-bye.